January 17th, 1945. 32,000 feet above the Kanto Plain. The sky over Japan stretched vast and indifferent, a cathedral of thin air where breath came shallow and frost painted the inside of cockpit glass. Flight Lieutenant Masao Iizuka banked his Nakajima K-84 fighter through the crystalline morning, his leather gloves stiff with cold, the engine's vibration traveling through his seat into his spine. Below, the clouds formed an unbroken white sea. Above, contrails streaked the stratosphere like chalk lines drawn by the hand of destiny itself. He was hunting. The radio crackled, 4 syllables in clipped military Japanese, B-29, B-29, the Superfortress. American bombers were approaching from the south, their aluminum bodies catching sunlight like migrating birds made of metal. Iizuka's pulse quickened. He had trained for this. They all had. The Americans flew high, yes, but they flew straight, predictable, arrogant in their machinery. Intelligence reports said their bombers were vulnerable, fat, slow, designed for payload, not for fight. Easy targets for a skilled pilot and a nimble fighter. He pushed the throttle forward. The Nakajima responded. He was 23 years old, and he believed completely in what he had been told. He did not yet understand that he was flying toward a reckoning. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. It was not merely an aircraft, it was an expression of American industrial philosophy made manifest in aluminum and fire. Each bomber cost $639,000 to produce, more than the entire annual budget of some small nations. The aircraft stretched 99 feet from nose to tail. Its wingspan measured 141 feet. 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower, drove it through altitudes where other bombers gasped and stalled. But these specifications, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The B-29 was the first production bomber to feature a pressurized cabin. Its crew flew in relative comfort at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled to breathe. It carried up to 20,000 pounds of bombs across distances exceeding 3,000 miles. Yet what distinguished it most completely from every bomber that preceded it was not its range, nor its ceiling, nor its payload. It was what happened when you tried to kill it. The Japanese Army Air Service had built its tactical doctrine on assumptions drawn from earlier encounters. American B-17s and B-24s over Europe had proven vulnerable to head-on attacks. Their nose guns offered limited traverse. A skilled pilot could approach from 12 o'clock high, fire into the cockpit, and break away before the waist gunners could track him. Japanese intelligence suggested the B-29 would follow similar patterns. Radio intercepts and captured documents indicated defensive armament, yes, but nothing that would fundamentally alter established fighter tactics. Attack from the front or below, exploit the blind spots, press close, kill the crew. What the intelligence reports had not conveyed, what could not be conveyed through technical specifications alone, was that the B-29 represented a philosophical departure from defensive thinking. American engineers had studied every combat report from Europe. They had calculated angles of attack, closure rates, bullet trajectories. They had interviewed surviving crews and examined bullet-riddled fuselages. Then they had designed a bomber that could see everything and shoot back with mathematics. Iizuka spotted them at 32,500 feet, a formation of 12 B-29s flying in a combat box, their wings level, their spacing precise. Sunlight flashed off polished aluminum. The bombers seemed to float there, suspended in the thin air like monuments to American confidence. He nosed his fighter upward, coaxing speed from the Nakajima's engine. The cockpit rattled. His vision narrowed. This was the moment, the approach, the kill.
He expected the bombers to maintain formation, expected their gunners to fire wildly, ineffectively, the way frightened men fire when death approaches too fast to track, expected to close to 300 meters before they could respond with any accuracy. He angled for the lead bomber's nose, classical attack, textbook, the same maneuver that had worked against B-24s over New Guinea. What happened next lasted less than 4 seconds. The lead B-29's upper forward turret rotated smoothly, twin .5 caliber machine guns elevated, tracking. Then something impossible occurred. The turret from the bomber flying 150 feet to the right, nowhere near Iizuka's attack vector, also rotated, locked, fired. Simultaneously, the central fire control gunner in the lead aircraft initiated a solution that allowed 3 separate turret systems to converge on a single target, Iizuka's fighter. 8 .5 caliber machine guns mounted on 3 different aircraft, all firing at the same moving point in space. The Americans called it the Central Fire Control System. It was developed by General Electric and installed as standard equipment on every B-29. Each gunner sat before a computing gun sight that calculated lead, deflection, altitude, and airspeed automatically. The system could slave multiple turrets to a single sighting station. A bombardier in the nose could control the upper forward turret. A gunner in the central blister could direct both upper and lower aft turrets simultaneously. Even the tail gunner's position, isolated in the aircraft's rear, featured analog computing mechanisms that adjusted for relative wind and target velocity. But the technology alone did not account for what Iizuka now experienced. Technology could be countered. Technology could fail. What shocked him, what froze his hands on the control stick for a critical half-second, was the precision, the patience, the absolute mechanical calm with which those 8 guns tracked his fighter through a high deflection turn at 32,000 feet. He broke left. Tracers followed. He dove. The streams converged. American .5 caliber rounds traveled at 2,900 feet per second. At convergent fire, they could punch through the Nakajima's relatively thin armor plating like needles through rice paper. Iizuka's wingman, Lieutenant Saito, attempted the same frontal approach from a different angle. He lasted 6 seconds before his engine exploded in a spray of burning oil. The K-84 tumbled, trailing black smoke. Iizuka never saw a parachute. He broke off, dove away. His hands shook. His training had not prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for this. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Phelps sat in the central fire control station of B-29 number 446-9803, nicknamed Rolling Thunder. Before him, the computing gun sight glowed with amber readouts. He was 20 years old from Akron, Ohio, and he had fired more than 100,000 practice rounds before his first combat mission. The Army Air Forces had spent 8 months training him, not 8 weeks, 8 months. He knew the ballistics tables by heart. He knew how temperature affected powder burn rates. He knew that at 30,000 feet, the air density dropped to roughly 30% of sea level pressure, which meant bullets dropped faster and required greater lead angles.
But more than knowledge, he had practiced, hour after hour on ground-based turret trainers, then in aircraft simulators, then in actual B-29s firing at towed targets over the Nevada desert. The training regime was exhaustive, repetitive, expensive. Each training sortie burned hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel. Each practice session consumed thousands of rounds of .5 caliber ammunition. Critics in Congress had questioned the cost. General Hap Arnold had been direct in his response. "We're not training gunners. We're creating specialists. There's a difference." Phelps tracked the retreating Japanese fighter through his sight. The computing mechanism hummed softly. He did not fire. The target was outside effective range, and he had been trained never to waste ammunition on low-probability shots. Discipline, economy, precision. American values, expressed in aerial gunnery. In the pilot's seat, Captain James Hartley maintained altitude and heading. The formation had not wavered. 12 bombers continued toward their target, the Nakajima aircraft plant at Ota, as if the fighter attack had been nothing more than a momentary turbulence. Hartley's voice came over the intercom, calm and flat. "Fighters breaking off. Maintain stations." That was all. No celebration, no relief, just the work continuing. This was the part Japanese intelligence had failed to predict. Not the technology alone, but the marriage of technology to training, training to discipline, discipline to industrial capacity. The B-29 program represented the single most expensive weapons development project in American history up to that point, exceeding even the Manhattan Project in total cost. More than 3,000 aircraft would eventually be built. Each carried 11 crew members, each trained to standards that would have been considered excessive for officers in most military traditions. The Americans had treated the bomber crew as a system, not a collection of individuals. They had invested in that system the way a nation invests in infrastructure, completely, without hesitation. Iizuka landed at Narimasu airfield 30 minutes later. His hands still trembled. He climbed from the cockpit, his flight suit dark with sweat despite the cold. The ground crew approached, their faces expectant. They asked about the engagement. He started to speak, then stopped. How could he explain? How could he describe the feeling of being tracked by invisible hands, calculated by invisible minds? The Americans had not simply defended their bombers, they had turned them into flying weapons platforms, where every gun, every turret, every optical sight functioned as part of a single distributed nervous system. Over the following months, the pattern repeated. Japanese fighter pilots approached B-29 formations with courage and determination. They died with courage and determination. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In 1945 alone, American B-29s would fly more than 34,000 combat sorties over Japan. Of these, only 414 aircraft would be lost to all causes: enemy action, mechanical failure, weather, and accidents. Japanese fighter pilots destroyed fewer than 150 of these directly in air-to-air combat. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. For every B-29 shot down, Japan lost an average of 7 fighters, and, more critically, 7 trained pilots who could not be replaced. The B-29's defensive fire destroyed more Japanese fighters than all other American aircraft types combined during the strategic bombing campaign. This was not because the B-29 gunners were more aggressive. They were, if anything, more conservative. They fired in controlled bursts. They waited for optimal firing solutions. They let enemies escape rather than waste ammunition. But when they fired, they hit. The central fire control system computed solutions at a speed no human gunner could match. The .5 caliber Browning machine guns fired with a reliability that approached 99%. The ammunition was manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Japanese pilots began calling the B-29 formations porcupine clouds. They developed new tactics: high-speed diving attacks, ramming runs, aerial bombing with phosphorus bombs dropped from above. Desperation breeds innovation, but desperation rarely breeds victory. There exists a photograph taken in April 1945 of a B-29 maintenance crew at Guam. 23 men and women stand beside their aircraft. The bomber's aluminum skin is pockmarked with small caliber bullet holes, evidence of a fighter attack that had failed. Someone has painted a small Japanese flag on the fuselage beneath the cockpit window, a kill marking. The crew members are smiling, but their smiles are tired. This was not glory. This was work.
That photograph captures something essential about the American approach to the air war over Japan. The B-29 was not a miracle weapon. It was an engineered solution to a specific problem, executed with industrial thoroughness. American factories produced one B-29 every 63 minutes at peak production. American training facilities graduated bomber crews in continuous cycles, their skills honed to professional standards. American logistics chains moved fuel, bombs, spare parts, and ammunition across 6,000 miles of ocean with clockwork regularity. The Japanese had expected individual heroism to counter material superiority. They had expected spirit to defeat machinery. They were not foolish in this expectation. Spirit had carried them through previous conflicts. But the B-29 represented something different. It was not just superior machinery. It was superior machinery operated by men trained to professional standards, supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than those losses could be inflicted, backed by a strategic vision that measured success not in dramatic victories, but in cumulative destruction. When a B-29 gunner pressed his firing trigger, he set in motion a chain of events that began in copper mines in Montana and powder mills in Missouri. The bullets he fired were manufactured in factories that employed thousands. The gun barrels were forged in facilities that produced them at a rate of hundreds per week. The optical sights were assembled by workers who understood nothing of combat, but everything about precision tolerances. This was the real weapon. Not the aircraft, but the system that created, crewed, maintained, and deployed the aircraft. By June 1945, Japanese fighter interceptions of B-29 formations had become sporadic, not because Japanese courage had faltered, but because Japanese capability had evaporated. The pilots were undertrained, their aircraft under-maintained, their fuel supplies critically short. The few who managed to intercept found themselves facing not only the B-29's defensive systems, but also swarms of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts. The sky over Japan had become American property. Lieutenant Iizuka survived the war. He would later write in his memoir, published in 1972, about that January morning over the Kanto Plain. He described the shock of recognition, the moment when he understood that he was not facing merely a better weapon, but a different kind of war entirely. "We were samurai," he wrote, "attacking a factory. The factory did not acknowledge our courage. It simply produced our defeat, piece by piece, with mechanical efficiency." This was not bitterness, it was observation. The B-29 and its systems embodied a certain American philosophical stance that problems could be solved through analysis, engineering, and resource application, that individual heroism, while admirable, was less reliable than institutional competence, that wars were won not by the sharpest sword, but by the most comprehensive system. On the flight line at North Field, Guam, the armament crews loaded the B-29s for another mission. Each bomber would carry 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs. Each bomb had been transported from California, offloaded at the docks, trucked to the airfield, and hoisted into the bomb bay by crews who performed this task with the efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. Because that's what they were. The American military had industrialized warfare completely. Not just the weapons, but the methods. Not just the equipment, but the mindset.
The bombers taxied. Their engines roared with a sound that carried across the island. Takeoff weight, 135,000 pounds. Fuel load, 8,200 gallons. Crew, 11 men, each a specialist. Destination, targets selected by analysts who studied reconnaissance photographs and industrial production reports. Ordnance load calculated for specific destructive effects. Flight path optimized for fuel efficiency and defensive positioning. The Japanese had expected easy targets. They had been given a glimpse of something else entirely. A demonstration of what happens when industrial capacity, technological innovation, professional training, and strategic patience converge. The B-29 gunners who fired back with such precision were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were technicians, and in that distinction lay the future of conflict.
Years later, historians would debate the ethics of the strategic bombing campaign. They would question the necessity, the morality, the human cost. These are important debates, but they should not obscure a fundamental truth that became visible in the skies over Japan in 1945. American power rested not on individual superiority, but on systematic competence. The freedom to build such systems, the abundance that made them possible, the democratic institutions that, for all their flaws, channeled national energy toward collective goals with unprecedented efficiency. The B-29 gunners fired back with precision because their nation had invested in precision, had valued it, had built entire industries around the concept that quality, multiplied by quantity, produces inevitability. Lieutenant Izuka had been brave. His wingmen had been brave. Bravery was not enough. Against the American system, bravery was a vanishing resource, expended with each sortie that ended in smoke and falling metal. The contrails faded. The bombers flew on. Below, Japan burned. And in the thin, cold air above it all, the computing gun sights hummed, tracking, calculating, waiting with infinite mechanical patience for the next target to enter their fields of fire. This was the thunder that answered.